Well, we're delighted to be back here with our good friend, Brian Wesbury, Force Trust Portfolios. Thank you very much for being here.
Jeff.
Always good to see you.
Always great to be with you.
Yeah, so kind of a lot's happened since the last time that we talked.
Yes.
But you had this great line the other day. It was recently anyway. You said, politics just makes us stupid. I thought that was the greatest line. That was just a great line.
Right.
So did the midterms make us any smarter?
No, unfortunately, I don't think so. And that's when I said politics makes us stupid, one of the reasons I said that is that all of these, especially talking heads, were running around thinking they could convince everybody that the economy was in recession because we had 2 negative quarters of real GDP. And that's not the definition of a recession. The National Bureau of Economic Research, they look at a wide variety of variables, industrial production, employment, personal income, all that. 5 out of those 6 things they look at were up. And so I said, yeah, GDP is kind of is down, but that's not a perfect number. If you look at all the components of the world, we were still growing. And so I think one of the reasons Republicans had such a tough time and the red wave didn't appear is that they complained a lot. There's a recession. There's inflation. Right. We all know the border. We know crime. Like they complained, but they didn't have any real answers. And that's the difference between, I think, Republicans today and maybe the 80s. Reagan and obviously Thatcher wasn't a Republican, but Thatcher and Reagan were able to articulate the answer of how to fix the problems and do it in a way that people could understand. And I don't know whether it's because politicians have become stupid or whether people's attention spans have become so short. Like if everything's on TikTok, how do you get Milton Friedman's ideas to people? Because back in the 80s, David Stockman, and he was the numbers geek for Reagan. He ran the Office of Management Budget. That guy could pack a stadium. Yeah. People would come hear him talk about the budget deficit and inflation and all of those things. Milton Friedman could pack a stadium, and I don't know if they could do that today. And that's where I say politics makes us stupid.
Yeah. You mentioned recession. I don't believe we're in a recession either. I look at it, I just look around, right? So we flew here. We're in beautiful West Palm Beach right now, right? And the hotel is full. You go out to, there's a little restaurant. You go to the restaurants, they're full, they're packed, hearty reservations, the planes are packed. Hotels are charging exorbitant prices, right? Exactly. And they're full. And so that's not what a recession feels like, right?
Exactly.
And so, and yes, and when I talk to clients, I too have said, look, 2 quarters is not the definition of inflation or a recession, and they look at me like I'm trying to make some sort of political statement.
Right.
And I'm not. I'm sorry, I'm not. I mean, this is just the way it is.
Right.
But so, talk to us about your thoughts on recession, when that's coming, and kind of where that's going to head. What that recession might look like.
Right. Just to go back one half step. If you Google what is a recession, it comes up with 2 quarters of decline in real GDP.
Yeah. Do you think every time that we've had a recession, we've had 2 quarters, right?
It's just a rule of thumb. Right. It's like it's an easy way to say it, but that's not the real definition. Right. And I just remind people, well, then Google vaccine. Because it used to be it cures the disease. Yeah, right. Now it just keeps you from dying from it. Right. And that's so definitions change over time. Right. Anyway, so I don't think we're in one yet. One of the reasons I think that people have a hard time figuring out what's going on in the economy, think about everything you said, hotels, airplanes, restaurants, it's all services. And those were the things that were closed down the most. Right. Whereas the goods side of the economy, Amazon stayed open, Home Depot, Walgreens, all of those businesses exploded. But now we bought way more goods than we would have normally because services were shut down and we were handing out checks. And so there are layoffs, and we see them. Right. Amazon's laying off, Carvana, Gap. It goes on and on. But that's all on the goods side. everybody's still catching up on the services. They're going to sporting events, they're going to hotels, they're taking vacations that they didn't take during COVID. And so that's why it's so weird right now. So the services are 70% of the economy, but I think they pretty much caught up to what they lost. And and then the Fed's raising rates, and all that extra money that we borrowed and handed out, it's running out. And as a result, I think a recession's coming, and it's coming in 2023. I always think of COVID like we had a car accident, and you broke your leg, and the ambulance shows up, and they give you morphine. And then you go to the emergency room, and the doc's saying, hey, how you feeling? You're like, I feel great, Yeah. And then he goes, well, you're not great, And that's sort of where we are. So we got through COVID because we borrowed all that money from our kids. We printed all that money, but now we're going to pay the price. The morphine is wearing off. The Fed's raising rates, and I think they're going to keep raising rates until something breaks.
Right. And so now we're in this inflation problem too, right? And through the handouts, and after COVID, we all got money in our checkbook, right? And we all went out and spent it. And so now we have this inflation, and the Fed. And talk to me about this, and you got to dumb this down for me a little bit, right? But you've been talking. So we haven't seen inflation like this in 40 years,
right?
And used to. The Fed would just raise rates, and be able to control kind of the inflation a little bit. You've talked lately about a scarcity versus abundance, right? About how the Fed views monetary policy. And that raising interest rates may not be the trick. Right.
Exactly.
So talk to us about that.
Yeah. So this can get really tedious and complicated. You don't need it dumbed down. I don't even think your audience does. But I try to explain it in a way that we don't go into monetary jargon. So pre-08, before quantitative easing was invented, Ben Bernanke invented QE, quantitative easing, QE. We had QE1, QE2, QE3. Well, back then, banks didn't hold hardly any excess reserves. So there was just enough reserves in the system to meet the requirements, and so what the Federal Reserve would do is that they would either make reserves a little more plentiful or a little more scarce, and then banks had to compete with each other for those reserves in the market. So we would have the federal funds rate, that's the interest rate where banks lend and borrow reserves. The Fed could kind of control it, but they did it through adding or subtracting money. And so there just weren't very many excess reserves. So the interest rate always was how much your reserves cost. But the banks would bid and ask for it. It would be a marketplace. Then they did quantitative easing, and the result of that is we went from a system where there were hardly any excess reserves to a system today where there are $5 trillion of excess reserves in the banking system. They flooded the banking system with cash and liquidity. It's amazing how much the money supply has grown because of all. That's where this inflation is coming from. But if there are all these excess reserves, then banks won't pay anything for them. Every bank has excess reserves, so there's no more market. So when today the federal funds rate, and it's 4%, the Fed just raised rates 75 basis points. It used to be 0. Now they're up all the way up to 4. They just make it up. I don't say that lightly. It's no longer, there's no market anymore. So they just set it at 4%.
Right.
And that's the difference between a scarce reserve model and an abundant reserve model. At least the banks and the market were part of setting rates before, but now it's just wherever the Fed wants to put it.